Okay, today we're going to be looking at indicator 7.5, part one. This is going to be on the Cold War and containment. Just to sort of do a rundown for you guys. Leading into this, World War II is over with. Now we're going to have a confrontation, really, or competition, really, between the United States and the Soviet Union. Remember, after the war is completed, the United States is left strong economically, and of course, the Soviet Union is left strong economically too. Um, both of these countries are victors after the war. They were allies after the war. They fought during the war, but now that the war is over with, they are the two strongest countries left, and that gives them the term superpowers, which is what we refer to the United States and the Soviet Union during this period after the war. Some things that you should be able to answer after watching this video and going through and writing down the notes are these learning objective questions. You can go ahead and jot them down now if you want, or you can wait till the end of the video and then jot them down. But please make sure that you can answer these questions. These are the main things that I'm looking for after going through the video lecture. Explain what the Cold War was. What is a satellite war? Explain how the world was divided by the Cold War. What were the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union? And ideological means how did they think about themselves? How were they viewed? What were the differences as far as what the Soviet Union was doing and what the United States was doing? Explain the Iron Curtain. Explain what containment was. And what were the different foreign diplomatic attempts by the United States to combat communism after World War II? So you want to address all these questions after you go through the video lecture, and you want to answer them on your video notes sheet. Let's start with explaining what the Cold War was. And I sort of alluded to this at the beginning of the video. Remember that the Cold War is really a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in ideas and global influence. That would be the definition that we would put down for what the Cold War was. Now, the Cold War wasn't fought in a cold place. It wasn't that there was a direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. But this period is very tense between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and it's going to go on for a while, really into the 1980s and early 1990s. So the Cold War is going to continue all throughout this period after World War II. Some of the fighting, though, that did take place, that's not going to be directly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but it's going to be between countries that the United States backed and countries that the Soviet Union backed. And we refer to this as satellite wars. You definitely want to write that definition down. It's when countries that were supported by the U.S. and countries that were supported by the Soviet Union did engage in some actual military combat against each other. So that will be a satellite war. But remember, the Cold War is not direct fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's really sort of a quasi-war would be the other term that you could possibly use. But know the definition for Cold War. Know that a lot of it involved satellite nations of the Soviet Union and satellite nations of the United States. Again, you can look at this map and get an idea what parts were controlled by the Soviet Union, and of course what parts were controlled by the democratic nations. All the areas in red are mainly going to be communist nations. All the areas in blue are going to be democratic nations. And really the Cold War II involves a ideological difference, and we're going to get into that in just a few minutes. But if you look at this map of Europe, you can see how Europe is divided, the red being communist, the blue being democratic, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. Again, after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were regarded as the superpowers. So make sure that you know that as well. If you've ever seen the clip Rocky, you sort of get to see this play out. Stallone there in the movie is the character Rocky. The guy in the red shorts is the character Drago. You don't have to write these down, but these guys are duking it out, and it's right during the height of the Cold War when this movie comes out, Rocky Four, and so there was a lot of hoopla about it because, of course, it's the United States versus the Soviet Union. Again, here's another world map showing you the breakup of countries that were, the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. You can see that. And of course, China is one of the very first or one of the next communist nations after the Soviet Union. So you can see that pictured here in this map. But you can get an idea about where these places were and who was backing who at this time. Now, let's look at the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. How were they different? What were some of the things that we're going to look at? And we're going to look at first the government and how the government was different. And you need to write these down. For the government, you had the United States being a democracy. We have free elections, and the citizens have rights. That was for the United States. If we look at the Soviet Union, they have a government that is a communist government or communism. They are ruled by a dictator, which is Joseph Stalin, and they have elections that were generally rigged. So that would be a breakdown of the government. Let's look at the economy and how those differences are. For the economy, remember, the United States is a capitalist nation, meaning we have a free market where we let the market sort of determine how much to charge for things, how much to produce of things, and so on. We have public and private businesses. And again, we are a free market. So that would be the United States economy. For the Soviet Union, you have a command economy. You should have had that term in geography at some point, but command economy, that means that the government is going to control businesses. And of course, there is limit on how much money you can actually make in a communist country. So the Soviet Union has a limit on the amount of personal income that someone can have. So those were the economy differences. Let's look at the next one, which is going to be espionage. Espionage, if you don't know what the term is, you might want to write this down too. Espionage is basically spying and who's doing that. So with espionage, the United States has a secret group known as the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency. And they are the ones who are responsible for most of the spying that's going to go on during this Cold War period. For the Soviet Union, you have a group known as the KGB, and that's the Committee for State Security. It is a secret police, and they're going to be responsible for most of the spying that the Soviet Union does during this Cold War period. As far as alliances go, and we're going to look at these in just a minute too, you had two alliances. For the United States, you have the alliance known as NATO, NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Most of the members in this alliance were allies of the United States. For the Soviet Union, you had an alliance known as the Warsaw Pact, and most of the members involved in this alliance were allies of the Soviet Union. The goal for the United States in the beginning of the Cold War is containment of the spread of communism. Communism, again, is the government and the economy, really, of the Soviet Union. So to stop the spread of communism, that's containment. The goal for the Soviet Union is going to be to spread communism worldwide. Okay, so those are the ideological differences. Make sure that you've written down these things for each one and you've explained them out so you understand them. And let's move on to the next. The next thing is the Iron Curtain. And the term Iron Curtain actually comes from Winston Churchill. He makes a famous speech after World War II saying that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and he's referring to the Soviet Union has put up this it's not a real barrier, but put up sort of this wall between East and West. It symbolizes the Iron Curtain. What it does is it symbolizes the division between communism in the East and democracy in the West. Make sure that you put that down. If you look at these maps, and there's a cartoon, political cartoon there, you can see the Iron Curtain, and you get to see the guys on the other side, the West, and you get to see people trying to escape underneath the Iron Curtain. They pretty much kept people from leaving the East and going to the West. So that's what you're seeing in that political cartoon. For as far as the map, you see this red line across this map. If you look at this red line, you get an idea of where that imaginary Iron Curtain actually stretched across Europe. The policy that the United States is going to adopt is called the policy of containment. This was initiated by Harry S. Truman, which you see over here on the far right. And pretty much, just to make it in simple terms, it was an effort to prevent the spread of communism. And the way he was going about doing that was sending aid and money, really military weapons, to countries that were fighting communism at this point. So that was the Truman Doctrine, and we're going to get into that in just a second. But the United States practiced the policy of containment, stopped the spread of communism. Truman is the one who initiates it. And again, this is going to be the main thing that's going to be used by the U.S. throughout most of the Cold War. For foreign diplomacy, let's look at what the United States actually does. For foreign diplomacy, the United States is going to get involved in an alliance after World War II called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is the flag of NATO, is what we refer to it as. Again, this was a military alliance that was created to be against the Soviet Union and against the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine comes out during this period after World War II. The U.S. would supply military aid and supplies to countries that were resisting communism. And one of those countries is going to be the country of Turkey. You definitely want to write that down. And again, he is trying to help any resistance rebels and trying to get them to encourage takeover from some of these countries that were communist governments or trying to fight against communism. So the Truman Doctrine stopped the spread of communism. The United States would supply military aid and supplies to those countries that were fighting against communist governments at that point. Final thing up here is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, very similar to the Truman Doctrine, but this is going to be issued by George Marshall, who was the Secretary of War during this period. He's going to offer money to any European countries that needed money after the war was over with. And believe it or not, the Marshall Plan even offered money to the Soviet Union. But naturally, the Soviet Union is not going to accept it because that would make them look weak. And so the Marshall Plan was put in place to offer money to European countries trying to recover after World War II. And of course, Stalin tried all sorts of things to block some of this aid to some of these European countries, but to no avail. Okay, that's going to take us to the end of this lesson. Make sure that you have taken very extensive notes and have written down the things that you need to know. Go back to these questions. These questions, again, are these learning objective questions. Again, I would write these down. Make sure you answer them, put them on your sheet, and then once you're done, make sure that I have checked you off for today. Okay, that's going to do it for part one. We'll pick up part two later on. So make sure you have these things down. If you have any questions, feel free to ask after you finish watching the video lecture, and we'll see you on the next one.